The moment Ida Garner walked into Holt's General Store on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, every man in Caldwell, Kansas who had half a heart knew better than to bother her. Every man, that is, except the one who had just arrived on the morning stage and didn't yet know the rules. The town of Caldwell sat near the Oklahoma border, and it was the kind of place that swallowed people whole and sometimes spat them back out changed, and sometimes didn't spit them back out at all. It was a cattle town, dusty and raw-boned, with a main street wide enough to turn a full wagon team and saloons enough to fill 3 blocks end to end. The spring of 1882 had brought a warm wind from the south that smelled of buffalo grass and iron-red earth, and the cattle drives were starting up again, which meant strangers were arriving daily off the stage lines and on horseback, and sometimes on foot with their boots half-eaten by the trail. Ida Garner was 31 years old. She had brown hair that she kept pinned under a sun-faded calico bonnet, and she had gray eyes the color of a sky about to make up its mind about rain. She was not a small woman, and she was not a frail one. She ran 12 acres outside of town, kept 4 horses, a milk cow, 17 chickens, and a kitchen garden that her neighbors spoke about with a reverence normally reserved for scripture. She had done all of this alone for 2 years, ever since Thomas Garner had fallen from the roof of the barn he was mending in the March of 1880 and broken his neck on the frozen ground below. 2 years. The people of Caldwell had watched Ida Garner very carefully in those 2 years, the way small towns watch their grief carriers, as if the widows and widowers among them were weather systems that needed monitoring. They had watched her bury Thomas in the churchyard on a Saturday. They had watched her drive herself home from the funeral in her own wagon without accepting a single ride. They had watched her plant her garden that same spring, a little ragged and late but planted nonetheless. They had watched her rebuild the fence Thomas had never gotten around to finishing, post by post herself, with her own hands wrapped in leatherwork gloves. What they had not watched her do was smile. Not once in 2 years. Not at Christmas, when the Hendersons had brought her a pie. Not at Easter, when the Reverend had made his particular joke about the empty tomb that always got a laugh. Not when little Clara Holt had run up to her in the street to show her the kite her father had made. Ida Garner's face had settled into something that was not quite sadness and not quite stone. It was simply a face that had decided there was nothing left worth the trouble of smiling for, and it had held to that decision with the same stubborn discipline she applied to everything else in her life. The women of Caldwell said it was grief and it would pass. The men of Caldwell mostly said nothing, because Ida Garner's expression when she was displeased with someone was the kind of thing that made seasoned cowboys look at the ground. This was the woman that Graham Wilcox walked into on a Tuesday morning in May of 1882, quite literally, because he came through the door of Holt's General Store at the same moment. She was turning around with a bolt of blue cotton fabric tucked under her arm, and he caught the fabric as it slipped, and she caught his arm as she stumbled, and for one absurd second they were tangled together in the doorway with the bolt of cotton between them and the morning sun blazing in from outside. Graham Wilcox was 34 years old, and he had the kind of face that made you feel like you'd seen it before even when you hadn't, an honest, open face, sun-browned and a little wind-scoured, with dark eyes that crinkled at the corners and a jaw that needed shaving about a day ago. He was tall, lean in the way that came from working rather than starving, and he wore a plain brown hat pushed back on his head in the way of a man who wasn't trying to impress anyone. He had ridden into Caldwell on a dun-colored horse named Compass, who was tied at the rail outside, because he had taken a job as a ranch hand with Delbert Purvis over on the Purvis spread east of town, and he needed supplies before he rode out to start. He did not know about Ida Garner. He did not know about Thomas Garner falling from the roof. He did not know about the 2 years without a smile. What he knew was that he had just nearly knocked a woman off her feet in a doorway, that she had caught his arm with a grip that told him she was no stranger to hard work, and that her gray eyes were looking at him with an expression that he recognized from the border territories as the look people gave rattlesnakes, not afraid exactly, but very clear about the situation. "Pardon me," he said, and he meant it entirely, and he took the bolt of fabric and steadied it under her arm properly before stepping back and taking off his hat. "I came in too fast. Are you all right?" "I am fine," said Ida Garner, in a tone that confirmed she was fine and also that she did not require any further conversation on the matter. She walked past him to the counter to settle her account with Walt Holt, who was watching the whole scene from behind his spectacles with the mild interest of a man who had been watching his store be a stage for human drama for 15 years and had made his peace with it. Graham put his hat back on, looked after her for a moment, and then looked at Walt Holt. "She all right?" he asked quietly, stepping up to the counter. Walt looked at him over his spectacles. "That's Ida Garner," he said, as if that explained everything, and in Caldwell it did. But Graham was not from Caldwell. "Should that mean something to me?" he asked. Walt considered him for a moment, and then, because he was not an unkind man, and because new hands in town deserved some understanding of the landscape they were walking into, he said, "Her husband died 2 years ago. She runs her place alone. She's doing fine, but she doesn't—" He paused and chose his words with care. "She doesn't want for company, if you follow." Graham looked over his shoulder. Ida Garner had paid her account and was now at the door, the bolt of fabric under her arm again, not looking at either of them. "Understood," said Graham. The door swung shut behind her. He bought his supplies: dried beans, salt pork, a new length of rope, and a tin of coffee, loaded them onto Compass, and rode out to the Purvis spread without thinking of Ida Garner again, because he was a man who respected boundaries when they were plainly stated, and hers could not have been plainer if she had written them in the dust. The Purvis spread was a working cattle ranch of some 400 acres, and Delbert Purvis was a stocky, red-faced man in his late 50s who ran a tight operation and paid fair wages, and asked only that his hands work hard and stay out of trouble. Graham had come recommended by a rancher in Dodge City who knew Delbert from 20 years back, and so there was none of the suspicion that new hands usually had to work through. He was given a bunk in the hands' quarters, shown around the place by a taciturn older cowboy named Pete Yancey who communicated mostly in nods, and put to work the same afternoon mending fence on the eastern pasture. It was good work. Graham liked good work. He liked the particular satisfaction of a well-set post and a tight wire, the way a fixed fence made a clear statement about order and intention. He had spent 15 years moving from ranch to ranch across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, not because he was restless by nature, but because he had never quite found the thing he was looking for, though he would have been hard-pressed to tell you what that thing was. He knew it had something to do with staying. He had watched men on every ranch he'd ever worked settle into the particular comfort of permanence. A house of their own, a woman who knew how they took their coffee, children who called them by a name that meant home, and he had felt the pull of it without knowing how to walk toward it. He was 34 and he had his health and his horse and enough saved to maybe buy a small piece of land someday, and that was the shape of his life, and he had generally made his peace with it the way you make peace with weather. It is what it is, and complaining doesn't change it. He thought of the woman in the doorway sometimes that first week, the way you think of things that surprised you, the grip of her hand on his arm, the gray eyes, the particular quality of her voice when she said she was fine, not brittle, not cold, just decided. He thought she was probably a remarkable woman, and he thought it was a sad thing that she wore her grief like a coat she had forgotten she was wearing. And then he went back to his fence posts, because that was not his business, and he was a man who knew the difference between his business and other people's. It was 3 weeks later that he saw her again. The occasion was the Caldwell Spring Social, which Delbert Purvis expected his hands to attend, because he felt it was good for the outfit's standing in the community, and also because he liked dancing and wanted company in liking it. So on a Saturday evening in late May, Graham put on his cleanest shirt and rode into town with Pete Yancey and 2 younger hands named Cord and Sullivan, and they hitched their horses at the church hall and went inside where the fiddlers were already playing, and the women of the Ladies' Aid had laid out enough food to provision a cattle drive. Graham danced once with the schoolteacher's wife, because she asked him to help her demonstrate a step to a group of younger girls who were learning, and he obliged because it would have been rude not to. And then he found himself a quiet corner with a cup of cider, and watched the room the way he always did, because he was a man who found rooms more interesting from the edges. Ida Garner was there because the Ladies' Aid had collectively decided she needed to be, and because Reverend Marsh's wife, Ruth, had shown up at her door that morning with the precise combination of sweetness and stubbornness that made it impossible to refuse. Ida had come, but she had made her terms clear. She would help with the serving table, and she would not dance, and she would leave when she judged she had stayed long enough to satisfy social obligation. She was standing at the serving table when Graham's eyes found her, not because he was looking for her specifically, but because she was the stillest thing in a moving room, and his eyes went to stillness the way other people's went to motion. She was wearing a dark blue dress. He thought it might be made from that cotton fabric he'd helped her catch in the doorway, and her hair was down from the bonnet and pinned more formally, and she was ladling punch into cups with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that if she was going to be here, she was going to be useful, and being useful was going to be her armor. He watched her for a while. He watched the way she answered when people spoke to her with courtesy, with care, but with nothing extra, nothing that gave anything away. He watched a rancher named Cole Beaumont come up and say something to her that made her look at the floor for a moment, and he watched her jaw set when she looked back up, and he thought that Cole Beaumont had probably said something about Thomas, something meant kindly but received like a stone through a window, and he felt for her in a way he couldn't have fully articulated. He stayed in his corner. It was not his business. Then Pete Yancey, who despite his taciturnity had a quality for mischief that revealed itself only in very specific situations, appeared at Graham's elbow and said, in the direction of Ida Garner, "She hasn't smiled since her husband died. 2 years. Whole town knows it. Clara Holt bet her brother a nickel that nothing could make her smile at this social." Graham looked at Pete. "That's a sad thing to be known for," he said. Pete shrugged. "World is full of sad things." He moved off, and Graham stood there a while longer with his cider, watching Ida Garner pour punch and accept thanks and say polite words to people and not smile, and something shifted in him that he didn't quite have a name for yet. It wasn't pity. He had a strong suspicion that Ida Garner would have dissolved him on the spot for anything approaching pity. It wasn't attraction exactly, not yet, though he was aware she was a handsome woman. It was something closer to recognition, the way you sometimes look at a person and feel, without any particular evidence, that you understand something essential about them. He put down his cup. He walked across the room. She saw him coming when he was about 6 feet away, and her gray eyes came up to his face with that same expression from the doorway, the snake and the clear situation. She recognized him. He could see it. He stopped at the serving table, picked up a cup, and held it out for punch with the air of a man who had come for punch and nothing else. She filled it. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. He did not move away. She looked at him. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, and the tone was the same, polite, final, not unkind, just very clear that she was done. And here was the thing. Graham Wilcox, standing there in the church hall of Caldwell, Kansas on a warm May evening in 1882, with the fiddles going and the lanterns swaying and 30 years of keeping other people's company, without making one his own. Graham Wilcox made a decision. He said with complete and deliberate seriousness, "Ma'am, I have ridden from Texas to Montana and back again, and I have got to tell you, that is the finest punch I have ever tasted in my life, and I am concerned I may never recover from it." There was a silence. Ida Garner stared at him, and then it happened. It started at the corners of her mouth, a sort of helpless twitch, like something trying to come up through frozen ground in the first real warmth of spring. She pressed her lips together against it. She looked down at the punch bowl with an expression of extreme concentration, as if the punch required close supervision. And then, because it was apparently bigger than her will to contain it, and because the statement had been so perfectly, deliberately, magnificently foolish, a man standing in a church hall in Kansas telling a woman that Punch had undone him with his full chest and a straight face, Ida Garner smiled. It was a small smile. It was careful and brief, and she recovered herself almost immediately, pressing her lips together and looking back up at him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously amused and deeply suspicious. But Graham had seen it. He had been watching for it, and he had seen it, and something in his chest did a thing it hadn't done in a very long time, something warm and a little precarious, like a lantern catching in a wind. "You are very foolish," she said. "I am," he agreed pleasantly. "Graham Wilcox, ma'am. I'm working out at the Purvis spread. I came through your door a few weeks back and nearly knocked you over and then felt badly about it all the way to the east pasture." She looked at him for a long moment, this woman who had not smiled in 2 years, and the smile was gone now, but something else had taken its place, something that was not quite the full Stonewall either. A crack, maybe, a hairline fracture in the careful armor. "Ida Garner," she said. "I know," he said. "Walt Holt told me." "Walt Holt tells everyone everything," she said. "He told me your name and that you were doing fine," Graham said, which looked true from where I was standing. "The rest I figured out myself. And what did you figure out?" she asked, and there was an edge to it, a challenge, the edge of a woman who has been the subject of other people's figuring for 2 years and is thoroughly tired of it. "That you're very capable," he said simply, "and that this punch is genuinely remarkable and someone should tell the lady's aide." The corner of her mouth moved again, just barely, just enough. He picked up his cup and touched the brim of his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Garner," he said, and he went back to his corner. She watched him go, and then she watched him not look back at her, not once, just slide back into his quiet spot at the edge of the room with his cup of punch and his honest, open face. And she found that unexpectedly, annoyingly, in a way she was not at all prepared for, she kept knowing exactly where in the room he was for the rest of the evening. She left at 9 o'clock as she had planned. She drove herself home in her wagon under a sky full of stars and the smell of buffalo grass, and she thought about Thomas, as she did every night, with the particular ache that had settled into something quieter than the first year's grief, still present, still real, but worn smooth at the edges now, like a stone carried a long time in a pocket. She thought about his laugh and the way he'd looked at her across the breakfast table, and the morning she'd come down to find him trying to fix the kitchen pump, and getting soaked for his trouble and laughing so hard he had to sit down. And then, unbidden, she thought of a man in a church hall saying he might never recover from punch, with a perfectly straight face, and she put her hand over her mouth in the dark of the wagon and felt the smile come up again, and this time she let it, because there was no one to see it, and it felt, unexpectedly, like breathing. It frightened her a little, that feeling. She was aware of it, and she set it aside carefully, the way you set aside something fragile, and she drove home and put up her horse and went to bed, and she did not let herself think about Graham Wilcox again until morning. In the morning, she thought about him for approximately 4 minutes before she firmly stopped and went out to feed the chickens. She ran into him 2 weeks later at the livery stable, where she had brought one of her horses for a new shoe. He was there returning a piece of borrowed equipment to the livery owner, a man named Abe Strickland, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him, and there was that particular moment of mutual recognition that people have when they have thought about each other more than they have admitted, even to themselves. He nodded. She nodded. He started to turn away, giving her the distance she had established, and she found herself, before she had decided to saying his name. "Mr. Wilcox." He turned back. "The punch," she said, and she said it with an expression that was carefully neutral but that carried, if you knew where to look, a small and private light in it. "I asked Ruth Marsh what she put in it. It was mostly water and sugar and a little dried berry she orders from St. Louis. He considered this for a moment with absolute seriousness. Then it was a miracle, he said. This time the smile was less brief. It lasted almost 3 seconds before she managed it back under control, and she looked away from him at her horse, which was being newly shod by Abe's apprentice, and she said, "You are a very strange man." "That's what Montana told me," he said. She glanced back at him. "Do you intend to stay in Caldwell?" she asked, and she asked it in the tone of someone making a practical inquiry and absolutely nothing else. "For a while," he said. "I like the Purvis outfit. Delbert is a fair man." "He is," she agreed. "His wife, Clara Purvis, is one of the best people in this county." She paused. "He keeps good hands. If he kept you, that means something." "I'll try to live up to it," Graham said. They stood in a not entirely uncomfortable silence for a moment, the horses moving in their stalls around them, and the sound of the forge going in the back, and the dry, warm air of early June coming in through the open doors. "I have a fence post that's rotting," Ida said, and she said it very quickly, and then she looked at him with an expression that dared him to make anything of it. "Third one from the north gate. I have the post. I just need a second pair of hands to hold it while I tamp it in. I cannot find anyone to spare an afternoon." He looked at her. He understood entirely what it had cost her to say that. He understood that it was not entirely about the fence post. "Sunday I'm free," he said. "I could ride out in the morning." "I'll have coffee," she said, as if that settled it as a business arrangement and nothing more, and then she turned back to her horse with a finality that dismissed him politely, and he touched his hat and left. He rode out to the Garner place the following Sunday morning with the sky, a clear, hard blue, and the prairie grass beginning to green properly, and Compass moving underneath him, with the easy rhythm that Graham had come to think of as the closest thing to contentment he knew. The Garner place was a good farm. He could see it as he came up the lane. The house was small but well kept, the paint on the porch rails a little weathered but holding, the kitchen garden already coming in strong, rows of beans and early tomatoes, and what looked like squash coming up along the south wall. The barn was sound. The fence around the main pasture was mostly solid, with that one compromised post at the north gate that sat at a noticeable tilt. Ida came out of the house as he tied Compass at the rail. She was wearing a work dress today, sensible dark calico, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair pinned back practically, and she was carrying 2 tin mugs of coffee that she handed him one of with the same matter-of-fact directness she applied to everything. He took it. He tasted it. "Good coffee," he said. "I know," she said, and there was something so unbothered and certain about the way she said it that he felt the beginning of a grin and had to work to suppress it, because he was not going to be the only person in this arrangement making a fool of himself. They drank their coffee on the porch, and she showed him the fence post situation from a distance and explained what she needed done, and he asked 1 or 2 practical questions and she answered them, and it was all very businesslike and efficient. And then they went and fixed the fence post, and it was there, working together in the June sun with the dirt and the tamping bar and the effort of it, that something changed again. Because Ida Garner at work was a different thing than Ida Garner in a church hall or a general store. She worked with a focused intensity that was somehow easier than her social manner, less guarded, more direct, no energy wasted on the careful management of other people's impressions. She handed him things before he asked for them, anticipated the weight and angle required, and didn't apologize for being strong when she was strong. And when the post was finally plumb and the dirt tamped firm around it, she put her hands on her hips and looked at it with the satisfaction of something genuinely accomplished. And that was when he saw the woman underneath the grief, the woman who had always taken satisfaction in work done right, who had always been this capable and this clear-eyed and this present in the physical world. "Thank you," she said. "My pleasure," he said, and he meant it. She invited him to stay for the noon meal, which she said simply and practically, and which he accepted simply and practically, and they sat at her kitchen table and ate cornbread and bean soup, and she told him, because he asked and asked the right way, with interest, and without the awful weight of sympathy, about the farm, about the horses, about the particular personality of the milk cow, whose name was apparently Josephine, and who had strong opinions about when she was milked. He listened to all of it with genuine attention and genuine amusement, and at some point during the description of Josephine's character, Ida laughed. A real laugh, short and a little surprised at itself, but real. She looked startled by it. He noticed and said nothing, and moved the conversation along so she didn't have to reckon with it right away. He left after the meal because he had said he'd come for the fence post, and the fence post was done, and he was a man who kept to what he said. He told her the post would hold and to check the 1-2 down from it in a few months because he thought the grain was starting to show. She walked him to the gate and he untied compass and mounted. "Mr. Wilcox," she said. He looked down. "You're welcome to come by again," she said carefully, "if you find yourself with nothing particular to do on a Sunday." He nodded. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Garner." He rode off down the lane, and she watched him go. And then she turned back to her farm with a feeling she couldn't quite name, something lighter than what she'd been carrying, something that alarmed her and comforted her in equal measure. He came the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and then it became a thing that simply happened, without being formally arranged or agreed upon. Graham Wilcox riding out to the Garner place on Sunday mornings with compass under him and the prairie wide and blue-skied around him, and Ida Garner having coffee on when he arrived. They found work to do together when work presented itself, and when it didn't they talked. They talked on the porch when the mornings were fine, and at the kitchen table when it was hot or raining, and they talked about things that mattered and things that didn't: the state of the cattle market, the difficulty of getting decent seed stock, the particular injustices of the railroad rates that squeezed small farmers until their margins were almost nothing, which was a subject on which Ida had sharp and well-formed opinions. They talked about where they had come from. Ida was originally from Missouri and had come to Kansas with Thomas in 1873 when they were young and newly married, and the land was going cheap. Graham was from Texas, near San Antonio, and had left at 19 after his father's death to make his way, and had been making it in various directions ever since. He told her once, on a rainy Sunday in July with the rain coming off the roof in a steady curtain, and the windows sheeted gray, about a particularly bad winter he'd spent in Montana, stuck in a line camp for 6 weeks with only 2 other men and a dog and a pack of cards. And he told it with such precise detail and increasing absurdity that by the end of it she was laughing so hard she had to put down her coffee cup. Real laughter this time. Not the surprised, brief kind, but the kind that takes hold of you and shakes you and leaves you slightly breathless. She realized afterward that she hadn't laughed like that since before Thomas died. It should have felt like a betrayal, and instead it felt like finding a room in a house she thought she knew that she hadn't known was there, warm and lit and waiting. She told him this, not directly, but in the way she talked about Thomas that afternoon more freely than she had talked about him to anyone, the actual Thomas rather than the sainted dead version, the Thomas who had fixed things wrong the first time and had to fix them again, the Thomas who sang off-key with great confidence, the Thomas who had been genuinely terrible at poker and had played it anyway with cheerful determination. Graham listened to all of this and laughed in the right places and asked the right questions, and he never looked at her with that awful careful look of people managing her grief, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like someone worth loving," and she had to look away for a moment because her eyes had gone wet and she didn't want them to. "He was," she said. "He absolutely was." They sat in the quiet for a little while, and then Graham said, "I had a dog once in Texas, smartest dog I've ever known. Named him Judge because he had opinions about everyone he met." And she laughed again, and the afternoon went on, and somewhere in the middle of it Ida became aware that she looked forward to Sundays in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in 2 years. She was honest enough with herself to know what that meant. She was frightened enough by it that she spent 2 weeks in August being cooler than she needed to be, shorter in her answers, more formal in her manner, putting the careful stone wall back up brick by brick. Graham noticed. He was not a man who missed much, and he noticed, and he did not push. He came on his Sundays and was pleasant and easy, and did not demand anything she wasn't ready to give, and he did not ask what had changed or press her to explain herself or look hurt in a way that would have obligated her. He simply continued to show up, regular as weather, and waited. She appreciated it. She appreciated it enormously, and it frightened her that she appreciated it, because appreciating things led to wanting things, and wanting things led to depending on them, and depending on them led to— she knew exactly where it led. She had learned where it led on a cold March morning 2 years ago. It was Pete Yancey who knocked her sideways on the question, which was the last person she would have expected. She was at Holt's General Store in late August when Pete Yancey came in for tobacco, and they exchanged the nods of people who know each other slightly and share a mutual acquaintance. And then Pete, who was not given to small talk, said with perfect directness, "Graham's a good man, Mrs. Garner. Best I've ridden with. Doesn't say much that isn't worth saying." He took his tobacco and his change from Walt Holt. "Just in case that was a question you had." He left. Ida stood at the counter for a moment. "Did he plan that?" she asked Walt. Walt looked at his ledger. "I couldn't say," he said, which was his way of saying yes. She drove home thinking about it. She thought about it that evening on the porch, watching the sun go down over her 12 acres and listening to Josephine complaining about something in the pasture. She thought about the fact that Graham Wilcox had never once made her feel like a project or a charity case or a piece of unfinished business that the town needed to resolve. She thought about the fact that he made her laugh in a way she'd forgotten she could laugh. She thought about the fact that every Sunday when she heard Compass coming up the lane, something in her chest lifted. She thought about Thomas. She thought about his face and the way he had kissed her forehead when she was worried, and the particular sound of his voice saying her name. She thought about loving him, really loving him, the way you love someone when you are 22 and the world is enormous and full of possibility. She thought about what it felt like to know with absolute certainty that someone is yours and you are theirs. And she thought, Thomas is gone. He is gone and he is not coming back, and he would not. She knew him. She had known him completely, and she knew he would not want this for her. Not the stone wall. Not the 2 years and counting of careful, isolated competence. He would have hated the idea of her alone out here, building her fence posts in solitude, not laughing at anyone's jokes. She was 31 years old and she was tired of being alone. She sat with that for a while, and it was terrifying and necessary and real. When Graham came the next Sunday, she was waiting at the gate instead of on the porch, and he pulled Compass up and looked down at her and saw something different in her face, something that had opened or decided, and he waited. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "Why do you keep coming?" she asked directly, the way she did everything directly. He looked at her for a moment, and then he got down from Compass and looped the reins over the gate post and faced her properly, because it was that kind of question, and it deserved that kind of answer. "Because I like you," he said, with the same simplicity he brought to everything. "Because you're the most interesting person I've met in longer than I can say. Because you make Sunday worth getting up for, and I haven't had that in a while, and I'm not inclined to give it up unless you tell me to." Ida looked at him. The morning was very bright and very still around them, just the wind in the grass and Josephine's distant commentary. "I'm not going to tell you to," she said. Something in his face eased. "Good," he said. They stood there for another moment, and then she said, with the particular brisk efficiency that meant she was covering emotion she wasn't ready to display yet, "Well, there's a gate hinge that needs looking at." And he said, "Show me." And they went to look at the gate hinge. But things were different after that. Not dramatically. Ida was not a dramatic person, and Graham was not a man who rushed, but differently different. in the way of a door that has been unlocked even if not yet opened. She stood closer to him when they worked. She looked for his eyes when she said something that was meant to be funny, checking for his particular response, the quiet grin that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. He started staying later on Sundays, until the supper hour, and she started cooking extra, and neither of them acknowledged this as a thing that was happening because acknowledging it would have required them to discuss what it meant, and they weren't there yet. They got there in September. It was a September evening, and the light was going golden and long across the pasture, the kind of September light that Kansas does better than anywhere, warm and amber and thick as honey. They were on the porch and she had brought out the mending, which she sometimes did when they talked because it kept her hands busy and her hands were restless people, and he was leaning back in the other chair with his hat on his knee, and they had been talking for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. And she looked up from her mending at the light on the pasture, and she said, quietly, almost to herself, "I've been happy on Sundays. I didn't think I was going to be again. Happy." Graham was very still. She looked at him. Her gray eyes were steady and direct and a little afraid. "I'm telling you that," she said, "because I think you should know it. And because I think you already know what it means, and I'd rather be honest about it than pretend otherwise." He put his hat down on the porch floor and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her with the full of those dark eyes that crinkled at the corners, and he said, "I know what it means. I feel it too, Ida. I have felt it for a while." It was the first time he had used her first name. She felt it like a hand pressed gently over her heart. "I'm scared," she said. "I know," he said. "That seems right to me. I'd be worried if you weren't." "I loved Thomas," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I'm glad you did. A person who loved well is a person who knows how to love. That's not a thing to be sorry for." She looked at him for a long time, measuring something, the way she measured everything with care and honesty and all her full attention. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he said. He reached across and took her hand, the one not holding the mending, the left one, resting on the arm of the chair, and held it, not tightly, just held it, steady and warm, and they sat on the porch and watched the gold light thicken on the pasture until the sky went pink and then purple and the first stars came up. Josephine had been still for once. After that, things moved with the particular momentum of 2 sensible adults who have finally stopped standing in their own way. Graham rode over on weekday evenings when the work allowed. He met Josephine and was properly impressed by her personality. Ida came out to the Purvis spread one Saturday to watch a horse breaking that she'd heard about and ended up in conversation with Clara Purvis, who was a broad-faced, sharp-minded woman of 50 who took to Ida with an efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for an occasion to do so, and who told Graham afterward privately that he had better not let that one get away. And he said, with a gravity that made Clara laugh, that he did not intend to. October came, and the trees along the creek bent gold, and the air had that autumn edge to it, cold in the mornings and still warm enough in the afternoon. And Graham took Ida out to see a piece of land on the east side of the county that had come up for sale. Not the Purvis land. A separate piece. 160 acres of good grass with a reliable creek running through it, and an old house that needed work but had solid bones. He showed her the land, the way a man shows something he cares about to the person he most wants to share it with. He told her he had been saving for a while, that he thought he had enough for the land itself, that the house would need 2 full seasons of work to be right, and that he was not proposing anything she hadn't decided she wanted. Ida walked the land with him in the October light, looking at the creek and the tree line and the grass and the bones of the old house, and she could see it, the way you can sometimes see a thing whole before it exists, the shape of what it could be. She could see the kitchen garden along the south wall. She could see the pasture fenced properly. She could see the smoke from the chimney on winter mornings. She turned and looked at him, this man who had come into her life through a doorway in May with a foolish joke and a straight face and an inexhaustible supply of Sunday morning patience. "It's good land," she said. "I think so," he said. "The creek is reliable," she said. "I know this creek. It doesn't go dry in August." "That's what Delbert said," he said. She looked at the house. "The roof needs replacing before anything else," she said. "And the foundation on the north side wants shoring up." "You'd need help for the roof." "I have friends," he said. She looked at him again, and he looked back at her, steady and patient and warm. The man who had watched her smile for the first time in 2 years and had the good sense to make it happen with something deliberately foolish, who had shown up every Sunday without pressure and without agenda, who had held her hand on the porch in the September light without demanding anything in return. "Graham," she said. "Ida," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're saying yes," he said to confirm. "I'm saying yes," she said. "I'm saying yes to the land and the creek and the roof that needs replacing. I'm saying yes to all of it. I have 12 acres and 4 horses and a milk cow, and I am—" She stopped, and then she said the true thing, the thing underneath all the practical words. "I'm not done with my life. I thought maybe I was for a while there, but I'm not, and I would like very much to not be done with it with you." Graham took both her hands in his, there on the October land with the creek running quiet and the gold light everywhere, and he said, "I have been looking for a reason to stay somewhere for 15 years. I have been looking for it in Texas and Oklahoma and Montana and Kansas. It was a person, it turns out. It was always going to be a person." She turned her face up to his, and he kissed her, gently and with great care, the way you approach something you intend to keep. She kissed him back without the careful stone wall, without the armor, just herself, Ida Garner, 31 years old, a farmer and a widow and a woman who had learned that grief and love were not opposites, and that surviving something terrible was not the same as being finished with living. They were married in November, in Reverend Marsh's church on a Saturday morning, with the first real cold of the season coming in off the plains, and the church filled with most of Caldwell because, as Walt Holt observed from the front pew, this was the kind of thing people needed to see. A person they had watched close up and go still finally coming back to life. Clara Purvis cried in the third pew and then told anyone who mentioned it that she had something in her eye. Pete Yancey stood in the back and was expressionless, but he had pressed his shirt, which Pete Yancey did not do for ordinary occasions. Graham wore the good black coat he had bought in Dodge City 3 years ago and never had occasion for. Ida wore her blue dress, the one made from the cotton from Holt's General Store, and she had let Ruth Marsh put some small flowers in her hair, white ones from Ruth's greenhouse, which were the kind of small grace that Ruth Marsh specialized in. When Reverend Marsh said the words and Graham said "I do" and Ida said "I do," and then Graham slid a plain gold band onto her finger. It had been his mother's, kept in a small leather pouch in his saddlebag for 15 years, for the right occasion. When all of that happened, there was a sound in the church that was not quite crying and not quite cheering, something halfway between, the sound of a community that had been worried about one of its own and had just been relieved. Clara Holt, who was 8 years old and had bet her brother a nickel that nothing could make Ida Garner smile at the spring social, leaned over to her brother in the pew and said, "I lost the bet, but this is better anyway." And her brother, who was 10 and occasionally sensible, agreed. They had the celebration at the Purvis Ranch, because Clara Purvis had insisted on it, and because the ranch house had the room and the space, and because Delbert had laid in extra supplies and gotten the 2 best fiddlers in the county. There was dancing, which Ida had declined at the spring social but now accepted readily, and she danced with Graham and with Delbert and with Pete Yancey, who was, against all expectation, a capable dancer, and the evening went long and warm and golden lit by the lanterns and the stove fire. Somewhere in the middle of the dancing, she pulled Graham close in a waltz and said quietly into the space beside his ear, "That punch joke was the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard." "I know," he said. "I meant it to be." She pulled back and looked at him. "You said it on purpose," she said. "You knew what you were doing." "I knew you needed something foolish," he said. "Something that didn't ask anything of you. Something that wasn't sorry for you or careful with you, just foolish. She looked at him for a moment and then she shook her head slowly, and she smiled the full smile, not the hairline crack or the controlled twitch, but the whole thing, the smile that her face had been keeping in reserve for 2 years, steady and real and brilliant. "You are a very strange man," she said. "Montana told me that too," he said, and she laughed and let him spin her through the waltz, and the lanterns swayed, and the fiddles went on. They spent their first winter as husband and wife in Ida's farmhouse, while the work on the new land proceeded whenever weather and time allowed. Graham had hired Pete Yancey for the roof work. Pete, it turned out, had been a carpenter before he was a cowboy, which Pete had neglected to mention but which explained certain things, and they had the new house's roof replaced by February. The winter was a good winter, in the way that winters can be good when you are not alone in them. Graham was up before dawn and Ida was up before Graham, and they had the rhythm of the morning established by the first week coffee first, then the animals, then breakfast, then the day's work divided sensibly according to who was better at what and what needed doing. They had arguments, because both of them were strong-minded and accustomed to doing things their own way, and the arguments were occasionally sharp but never cruel, and they always resolved because both of them had the habit of honesty. He told her once in February, over an argument about the best way to mend a piece of harness, that she was the most stubborn person he had ever encountered, and he meant it as a compliment, and she said the same about him and also meant it as a compliment, and they laughed, and the harness got mended her way because she was right about the harness, which he acknowledged. They moved to the new land in April of 1883, the 1-year anniversary of Graham's arrival in Caldwell, more or less. Pete Yancey and a handful of other hands from the Purvis spread helped with the moving, and Clara Purvis organized the women of the Ladies' Aid into a work party that descended on the new house and cleaned it from floor to ceiling in a single afternoon, with an efficiency that was slightly terrifying. By evening the house was habitable, and there was a supper laid out on the new table that Graham had built himself over the winter, and the house smelled of coffee and good food, and the particular smell of a home being made. Ida stood in the kitchen of the new house as the light went down and looked out the window at the south wall where her kitchen garden would go, and Graham came and stood beside her, his hand finding hers naturally as breathing. "The soil looks good," she said. "It is good," he said. "I'm going to need to get the planting in early," she said. "I know," he said. She leaned into his shoulder just slightly, just enough. "It's a good house," she said. "We'll make it a better one," he said. She turned and looked at him in the kitchen light, this man who had become, without announcement, without drama, through the accumulation of honest Sundays and foolish punch jokes and October land walking and winter harness mending, absolutely essential to her, the way water becomes essential, the way air does, not noticed until it's the whole of what sustains you. "I love you," she said. She had said it before, that winter, in the quiet, careful way of a person trying out a thing they hadn't said in a long time, feeling for the structure of the words to see if they would hold. They had held. "I love you, Ida," he said, with the simplicity that was the characteristic way he said anything true. They had their first summer on the new land, and it was the hard, good work of building the garden in, the fences proper, the barn repaired, the creek bank shored up where it was eroding, the house improved room by room as time and resources allowed. Graham had kept his agreement with Delbert Purvis through the spring, working part-time through the planting season for the steady wage while the farm got established, and Delbert had said he could come back any time and meant it, and Graham said he appreciated it and meant it. By the summer of 1883, the Wilcox farm was becoming the kind of place neighbors looked at with interest. The kitchen garden was legendary, which was perhaps not surprising given whose hands had planted it. They had added 2 horses to their existing 4, and Graham had an eye for good horseflesh that proved itself when 2 of the horses he bought turned out to be exceptional working animals that Delbert Purvis tried to buy back at a profit, and Graham sold him one and kept the other. In August of 1883, Ida told Graham she was expecting. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, matter-of-factly, as she told most things, and then she watched his face go through the particular sequence of expressions that she had only seen once before on a man's face, the arriving of something enormous, too large to process all at once, moving through surprise into something that cracked him open completely and left him sitting there with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth and his eyes very bright. He put the cup down. He said her name. She said, "Yes, I'm sure. I've been sure for 3 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down in front of her the way a man does when he wants to see a person's face properly. And he took her face in his hands, his large, calloused, work-honest hands, and he looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then he said, "You are extraordinary." "I am a farmer," she said. "You are extraordinary," he said again, and she let him have that this time. The pregnancy was not easy. The winter of 1883 was hard and cold, and Ida was nauseous through December and into January in a way that she found deeply tedious because there was work to be done, and her body seemed to have strong opinions about the work. But Graham was steadfast in a way that she found both touching and occasionally aggravating, because he hovered at the edge of hovering, which was the right instinct applied with such careful restraint that it was almost a form of grace. He cooked badly but willingly. He did more than his share of the outdoor work without making a point of it. He sat with her in the evenings with his book or his mending, and she sat with hers, and the stove was warm, and Josephine, who had been moved to the new farm and had strong opinions about it, could be heard occasionally from the barn, and it was very good. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a Thursday morning, delivered by a Caldwell midwife named Dora Cole, who was the most capable person Ida had ever met in a medical emergency, and who told Graham afterward that his wife was the most composed woman she had ever delivered for, which Graham believed completely. They named him Thomas James Wilcox. Thomas, for who he was named, for Ida had said it quietly one evening, that she would like the name if Graham was willing, and Graham had said without hesitation that he would be honored, and he had meant it in the full and true sense, and James for Graham's father. Thomas James Wilcox was a substantial baby with Graham's dark eyes and a pair of lungs that announced themselves with conviction at approximately 3 in the morning for the first 3 months of his life. He was then, without much transition, a calm and interested baby who watched the world from wherever he was placed with a focused attention that Pete Yancey said, on the occasion of his first visit, was exactly like his mother's. Pete Yancey was, apparently, capable of compliments when the occasion genuinely required one. The farm grew. The years moved with the particular rhythm of a place being built properly, not fast, not without setbacks, but steadily and with intention. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that was hard on the grass, but the creek held, and the kitchen garden survived with careful management. The fall of 1884 brought good cattle prices, and Graham sold 3 horses at the Caldwell market for enough to put a proper porch on the north side of the house, which had been the plan since the beginning. Ida ran the household and the garden, and kept the farm's accounts with a precision that made Graham slightly afraid of the ledger and extremely confident in its accuracy. Graham ran the livestock and the land management and the fencing and the heavier construction work, and they overlapped in the middle where overlapping made sense, which was most things. Their division of labor was not the conventional one. Ida could and did handle livestock when needed, and Graham could cook a serviceable meal when required. But it was their division, and it worked, and the farm showed it. Clara Purvis visited regularly and had taken a grandmotherly interest in young Thomas that she exercised at every opportunity. Delbert Purvis occasionally hired Graham for particular jobs, horse breaking, fence line surveys, and the relationship remained the good and honest one it had been from the beginning. Walt Holt continued to run the general store and to tell everyone everything, but as Ida said, at least he was consistent. In the spring of 1886, Ida found out she was expecting again, and this time the news arrived without the 3 weeks of careful silence. She told Graham the same day she was sure, over breakfast, and he set down his coffee cup with the same enormous arriving of something expression, and this time she was able to watch it with a kind of settled joy rather than the complicated mix of feelings the first time had involved. "Is it different this time?" he asked. He gestured, meaning the experience of knowing. "Yes," she said. "Last time I was afraid I was choosing too much happiness too soon, as if I didn't deserve it yet. And now," he said, "now I know that was wrong," she said. "Now I know that this is." She looked around the kitchen, their kitchen, with the herbs drying above the window and the list of farm tasks on the wall and Thomas's small shoes by the door. "That this is what being alive means. Not being safe from loss. Not being done with grief, just this. Making things with someone, making it matter." He reached across the table and held her hand, steady and warm, the way he always did. "You've always known that," he said. "You built this farm alone for 2 years. You knew how to make things matter before I ever came through that door." She considered this. "Maybe," she said, "but it's better with you." "It's better with you," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in December of 1886, and they named her Margaret Ruth Wilcox, Ruth for Ruth Marsh, who had put flowers in Ida's hair on her wedding day, and who burst into entirely unashamed tears when told the name. Margaret was a serene and decisive baby who slept through the night with a consistency that Thomas had never managed, and who developed, in her first year, the dark eyes of the Wilcox side, and the stubborn, focused attention of the Garner side combined into a personality of considerable force. Thomas adored her with the wholehearted certainty of a 3-year-old brother who has not yet learned ambivalence, which meant he also occasionally tried to give her unsuitable objects to play with and had to be reasoned with, and the reasoning conversations between Thomas and his parents were some of the better dialogues that had occurred in the Wilcox household, and would have made a stranger laugh. The farm, in 1887, was a fine piece of land by any measure. The house had been expanded, a second bedroom added when Thomas was 2, the porch proper and wide enough for chairs, the kitchen large enough for the entertaining that Ida had gradually discovered she didn't mind when it was on her own terms. The barn was tight and well organized. The garden was locally famous. They had a good reputation at the Caldwell market and an established relationship with 2 cattle ranches that bought their horses regularly. Graham had found at 39 what he had been looking for at 20, the reason to stay somewhere. It was not a piece of land, though the land was good. It was the woman who stood in it, gray-eyed and capable and able to laugh at the right things, and the children who were growing up in it, and the life that had been made from 2 separate and somewhat battered people meeting in a doorway and one of them having the presence of mind to be deliberately foolish. He thought about that sometimes, the specific arithmetic of it, that everything had turned on a moment he had calculated, that he had looked at a woman across a church hall who hadn't smiled in 2 years, and something in him had understood, not with sentiment, not with pity, but with plain clear seeing, that she needed something that wasn't sorry for her. Something that didn't ask permission to be offered. Something small enough to be refused without damage. A foolish joke. A ridiculous statement about punch. The smallest possible door. And she had opened it. He thought about it and was grateful for it in a way he didn't have easy words for, the particular gratitude of a person whose life has become more than they had the right to expect. They had a warm Sunday in May of 1887 when Pete Yancey came to supper, which had become a semi-regular occurrence, and they sat on the porch after while Thomas played in the yard under the spring evening sky and Margaret slept in the house. Pete Yancey and Graham talked about a piece of land Pete was thinking of buying, now that he was getting older and the riding life was becoming less appealing, and Ida listened with half an ear while she watched Thomas navigate a complicated negotiation with a stick and a small hill. "You'd want something with water," Ida said to Pete, "and not too far from town. The winters are better inside than in a line camp." Pete looked at her. He nodded. Coming from Pete Yancey, this was an enthusiastic response. "There's a piece on the Creek Road," Graham said. "Miller's old place. He's been trying to sell since the winter, has a decent house." They talked about Miller's place for a while, and Ida thought of Thomas Garner, not the small boy in the yard with the particular kind of thinking she did now, which was clear and loving and not sharp anymore, not the grief that had been like a splinter you couldn't get at. She thought of him and felt the fullness of what had been and what was, and both were real and both were hers. Later that evening, after Pete had ridden back down the lane and Thomas was in bed and Margaret had been fed and was sleeping again, Ida and Graham sat on the porch in the last of the light, the way they had sat on a September evening 5 years ago when she had told him she'd been happy on Sundays. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the farm was quiet around them, and the creek could be heard from here in the right wind, and the spring stars were coming up. "Graham," she said. He said, "Thank you for the punch," she said. He laughed. It was his real laugh, the one that started in the chest, and she felt it through her shoulder where she was leaning against him, and she smiled into the evening air. "That punch is the best investment I ever made," he said. "You should send a thank you note to the Ladies' Aid," she said. "I'll get right on it," he said. She looked up at him, tipping her face toward his in the dusk, and he looked down at her. Ida Wilcox, 36 years old, gray-eyed and straight-spined and carrying in her face now the particular beauty of a person who has been through fire and come out the other side not unmarked but whole, more themselves than before. And he thought, as he had thought many times in 5 years, that she was the finest thing he had ever seen. He kissed her in the evening light. She kissed him back. Across the pasture, Josephine made a philosophical comment about the hour, and one of the horses shifted in the barn, and the stars came up one by one over the wide Kansas sky. 2 years after that, in the spring of 1889, 2 things happened that between them finished the shape of the life they were building. The first was that Pete Yancey bought Miller's place on the Creek Road and moved himself and his considerable woodworking skills into it, which meant he could be called upon for projects and could reliably be found at the Wilcox table on the occasional Sunday, which Thomas, now 5, had decided was entirely correct because Pete Yancey was the person who had taught him to whittle, and this was the highest possible credential. The second was that Ida Wilcox, 38 years old and entirely aware of what it meant, told Graham in April that there was going to be a 3rd child. This time, Graham did not have the arriving of something expression. This time his face went immediately to what it was, the straight, deep, uncomplicated joy of a man who is home in his life, and he said "good" with a certainty and warmth that made the single word carry everything it needed to. "Good," she said. "Good," he said. "More than good. This is a good life, Ida, every piece of it." She looked at him across the breakfast table, their breakfast table in their kitchen on their farm, with their children sleeping in their beds above them. She thought about the woman she had been in 1882, driving to the general store alone on a Tuesday morning in a sun-faded bonnet, with her stone wall and her careful grief and her 2 years of not smiling. She thought about the way it had felt to carry that, the weight of it, the particular exhaustion of maintaining an absence. She thought about the church hall and the punch and the foolish man who had looked at her and seen, correctly, that what she needed was something that didn't ask permission. She thought about Thomas Garner with a love that was real and present and not diminished, not by time, not by what had grown in its wake. She thought about the truth she had learned, which was that the heart was not a fixed-capacity vessel, that love was not a resource that ran out, that grief and joy were not opposites but 2 different weathers in the same sky, and you could live under both without being destroyed. "It is a good life," she said. The baby was born in November of 1889, a boy they named William Delbert Wilcox, William because Graham had always liked the name, and Delbert because Delbert Purvis had been generous to both of them in different ways and deserved the acknowledgement. And when Delbert was told the baby's name, he went red in the face and had to excuse himself from the room, which was the most emotional anyone in Caldwell had ever seen him. William was a stout, cheerful baby who laughed early and often, and had Ida's gray eyes and Graham's stubborn jaw, and a temperament that could best be described as reliably good-natured, which in a household with a spirited 5-year-old and a 3-year-old of formidable personality was an enormous practical convenience. The Wilcox farm in 1890 was a full and living thing. There were 8 horses now, and the 3 good milk cows and the chickens and the kitchen garden, and the accounts kept in Ida's careful hand in the ledger on the kitchen shelf. And there were 3 children and Pete Yancey on Sundays and Clara Purvis at regular intervals and Reverend Marsh and Ruth for the occasional meal, and Walt Holt with the news of the county and the town, and the neighbors with whom they had the good, ordinary commerce of people building lives in the same territory. And there was the ordinary daily matter of themselves, Graham and Ida, the 2 of them, in the mornings before the children were up when the house was quiet and the coffee was on and the farm was just beginning to stir. In those mornings they talked or they didn't, and both were good. They had arrived at the particular intimacy of people who have been through things together and come out known to each other, not perfectly, not without friction, but known in the way that matters, the way that makes a person feel less alone in the world. Graham Wilcox, on a morning in early spring of 1890, stood at the kitchen window of his house and watched the sun come up over his land, and felt the precise and uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who has found what he was looking for and known it when he found it. The land was going green. The creek was running clear. The barn was sound. His wife was asleep in the room above him, the baby tucked against her, and down the hall his older children slept in the room they shared, Thomas spread-eagled across his bed in the way of a child who has claimed all available space, Margaret neatly arranged as she did everything. He thought of 15 years of moving. He thought of Texas and Montana and the places between, the good work and the bad winters, and the loneliness that he had become so accustomed to that he'd stopped calling it loneliness and started calling it just the way things were. He thought of a morning stage into Caldwell in May of 1882, and a door and a bolt of blue cotton fabric and a pair of gray eyes. He thought of a deliberate, foolish joke about Punch. He thought of the moment he had watched it happen, that small, reluctant, inexorable smile coming up through 2 years of frost like the first green thing of spring, and the feeling he had had, which he could name now because he had had years to put the right words to it. The feeling of watching a person come back to themselves, and knowing, with a certainty that was not arrogance but simply recognition, that you wanted to be present for every version of that person that came after. Ida came into the kitchen 20 minutes later with William on her hip and her hair undone, and a look on her face of someone who has been up since 5 with the baby and is nevertheless entirely composed, which was very Ida. She handed him the baby so she could start the coffee, and Graham took William against his shoulder and patted his back absently, while William regarded the kitchen window with the focused philosophical interest that babies and cattle shared. And Ida moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of a person who knows exactly where everything is because she put it there. And the fire was going and the coffee was on, and the house was waking up. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door in his nightshirt and announced that Margaret had taken his boot. "Why do you have one boot?" Graham asked. Thomas considered this. "I was looking for the other one," he said. "That does seem like the place to start," Graham agreed. Ida took the coffee off without smiling, or almost without smiling, the corner of her mouth moving in the way he had come to know meant she was suppressing it with some effort, and said, "Thomas, get your boots and get dressed." "Margaret, please return what is not yours." Margaret appeared behind Thomas with the boot and an expression of pure, unrepentant innocence. Thomas took the boot. Margaret went back to their room. The house proceeded into the morning with the comfortable, chaotic, irreplaceable noise of a family at work, and the farm outside the windows woke into the spring, and the creek ran clear on the east boundary, and the horses in the pasture moved through the early light, And the life that had been built from a foolish joke and a bolt of blue cotton, and 1,000 ordinary days of choosing each other continued, steady and alive and good, exactly as it was supposed to be. Ida Wilcox, stood at her kitchen stove with the coffee and the morning light coming in the south window, and she smiled. She smiled the way she had always smiled, before and after and through everything that life had brought, with her whole face, with the gray eyes and the particular light in them that meant she was all the way present, all the way here, all the way alive in the place she had built, and the life she had chosen, and the love that had come to her through a doorway in May on a morning in 1882 and stayed. She smiled, and Graham, watching her from across the kitchen with the baby on his shoulder, watched it happen, the same as he had that first night in the church hall, with the same warmth in his chest that had never once diminished. He caught her eye. She shook her head at him, the way she had been shaking her head at him for 8 years, the expression that said, "You are a very strange man, and I would not change a single thing about it." He grinned. The coffee was ready. Outside, the Kansas spring morning came on full and wide and blue, and the farm was exactly what they had made it, and that was everything.